Thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Did you have a choice?
Possibly it would have undermined my authority in the family if I'd refused.
I do remember when I asked you for the first time and the look of horror that briefly flitted across the face.
It's flitting across my mind. But...
So there are two reasons I wanted to do it. One is from a family perspective. One of the family artifacts that I love most is Nonno's memoirs, my granddad's memoirs, and Evie, in the writing of her book at the moment, is constantly saying, "I wish I'd asked more questions to her granny or to her grandpa about their history," and I want this to be an opportunity for me first and foremost to ask the questions maybe I've never asked before, but also for Rosie and Noah and the rest of the kids and maybe their kids, future generations, to be able to maybe they'll have different questions, but to have some of the answers that they wouldn't be able to ask you directly.
I'm very pleased about that, but reserve the right to dodge any question which I think I can't answer effectively.
That is fair enough. That is fair enough. And also, it's Father's Day on Sunday, so it's kind of a nice coincidence. In fact, I've just remembered. Happy Father's Day.
My goodness. I don't know this, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I was hoping that I'd be able to find something that you've never tried before. The reason I started the podcast in the first place, and I think I explained to you once or twice before, is that there's a couple of things. We're living in such a divided world at the moment, and people are finding it increasingly difficult to have conversations with people they disagree with. And I'm not suggesting that you and I are disagreeing on anything, but for me, as human beings, we're so much more alike than we are different. And one of the things that we all have in common is the fact that we all have insecurity, we all have doubt, we all have vulnerability. And I think it's important to be able to talk about those things, and maybe especially between men. What I've been doing with these conversations, and I've been talking to people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, whatever it is, understand and who have achieved some success in their life, whatever that means, because it's so subjective. And having them explain to me how they've achieved success despite of the insecurities, the vulnerabilities, the doubt. And when I was thinking about, the podcast has been on a bit of a holiday, and I've missed it actually. It's been about 12 months since I recorded the last episode. And when I was thinking about future guests, you definitely came to mind for the family reasons as well, of course. But you've lived a life, and I imagine we'll get into it. I imagine that you've had to overcome a lot in order to succeed. So that's the reason we're here today. Let's go back to Liverpool, where it all began. If we had a 14-year-old David here in the room with us, what kind of person, what kind of boy would I be talking to?
Well, it would depend actually in which part of the year that was, because it was a pivotal year in my life. A number of common features are that I was extremely thin. I had a very severe attack of permanent acne. I had a complete lack of social skills. So I would not have been a very desirable person for you to see if you went back in time. It was an important year for me because at the age of 14, I sat O-levels and I passed, not particularly brilliantly, in 5. That qualified me to go into the sixth form, which was a major ambition that I had, and it provided status within the school to be in the sixth form. But the head, who was extremely authoritarian and feared by all the pupils and a good deal of the teachers, I rather suspect, took the view that I would never succeed in the sixth form, and initially refused to allow me to progress. I got in purely as a result of the intervention of my father, and that was a feature that occurred constructively at other times in my life.
In what way did he intervene?
Well, the head had said that because I was not likely to succeed in the sixth form, I should go into the remove, and then at the end of that year, I would leave, and the school would find from its contacts an office-type job for me. And my father, for reasons I don't fully understand, had formed the view that I had the capacity to do well in life. And he was outraged by a decision like that by the head. So he very kindly told me that I had to ask for an interview with the head in order to demonstrate that I was worthy of the sixth form. I don't think, apart from appearing in the House of Lords before the Judicial Committee of Brilliant Minds, I don't think I've ever had such a fearful interview as that. But the head said, well, I'll think about it, but I want to see your father. And my father came down and sought to persuade the head that I had the capacity. And I was rather distracted at the time because I was involved in Hebrew classes, particularly for my bar mitzvah the year before. And the head said, does he want to be a rabbi or something? And my father denied that. And anyway, whatever eventuated in that conversation, the head allowed me to progress because he recognized I'd qualified for the sixth form, and it would be unfair to deprive me of a chance of showing what I could do.
It's interesting hearing about your dad, my Zayda, as I used to call him. I remember him as, I don't know, my memories of him are, of an affectionate granddad who took so much pride in his grandchildren. But it sounds like he had a inner steel that maybe I didn't see when I was younger. Is that right?
I think he did have an inner steel, and he had the potential to have had a very effective career. But he had to leave school at 14 to help with the family finances. And he took a job which turned out to be a dead-end job, which lasted the whole of his life and left him unfulfilled. And to some extent, he didn't want me to fall into the same trap, and was determined to do what he could to ensure that I reach my maximum potential.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds very much like his own experience kind of dictated the approach that he took to your schooling and the headmaster's decision.
Yes, and he was he was very proactive in monitoring how I was doing at school. But just around this time, because I had not done well in the lower school, he asked a neighbor who was a secondary school teacher if he would talk to me to see what interventions there might be which might assist me to progress. And that was the second time when he'd had the initiative to try and direct me into a better academic performance, really. So I spoke to the neighbor, and he tested me out with some very difficult reading, but took the view, A, that I had the ability to do better, and B, I was very immature, which I'm sure I was, particularly emotionally. And the best way of addressing that was to begin to read the great literature. I went into the school library, which was you were allowed to do when you were a sixth former, and found the Anthony Trollope novel, Dr. Thorne, and was entranced by that. So it's been one of my favorite books ever since. And that set me on the path of reading, which I'm sure was beneficial in many dimensions of my life.
What was, slight segue now, what was home life like? I remember I have I don't have many childhood memories for one reason or another. My childhood was a very happy one. That's just the way my memory works. But I do remember the house in Rudston Road. You know, for people that are meeting you for the first time now, they'll form an impression, middle class upbringing. But it wasn't like that.
No, I mean, they were probably lower middle class, but because my father had a very dead-end job which didn't bring in a lot of income, there was no money to spare for luxuries, including the purchase of books. And it was a caring home, but it didn't have the sort of things which have inspired me rather later in life, classical music, art, reading, travel, and that sort of thing. So it was a restrictive environment. But as it so happened, because I was preternaturally shy and insecure, it benefited me that I didn't have the challenge of social life. And I used to sit at home reading my mother's Woman's Own magazine, which taught me quite a lot, including a love for novels where the protagonists meet cute, don't like each other, but realize eventually they're in love and everything ends happily ever after.
So that explains your ongoing love of rom-coms.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you remember of your granddad? It's something that I don't think I've ever really asked you about.
Well,
he was an immigrant to the country, is that right?
He was an immigrant,
Yeah.
and so was his wife. The two of them didn't really engage in Liverpool life in a meaningful way. My grandfather founded a shoe shop, shoe repair shop. So to that extent, he was serving the community. But they lived an enclosed life within the Jewish community of a sort of derivative of the old shtetl sort of life. And it was not something that appealed to me. So I didn't engage anything like as fully with my grandparents as I now wish I had. I too didn't ask the questions about their background and history, which I should have. So it's left me with a big gap in my sense of identity.
That's interesting. Maybe we'll come back to that. Was there a lot of love in the house?
I did think my father and my mother had a particularly demonstrative love, but they were together for the whole of their lives. And therefore, there must have been a meaningful relationship. It was more typical of its time, perhaps, but it was not an expressive love relationship.
So what made you pursue a degree in law and go to Oxford? What was the thought process at the time?
Well, this was another thing that was determined by my father. My main subjects in school were particularly German, but also Spanish. And I had conceived from a position of total ignorance that the natural progression would be to join the diplomatic service. My father, I'm sure correctly, took the view that as a Jew, without the social background that tended to be required in the diplomatic service, I had no chance of being engaged, let alone progressing. And he suggested going into the law. And my first belief was that I'd be a solicitor practicing in Liverpool. And I was introduced to a solicitor whom I knew socially, and I went in and talked to him. And that was the fixed belief I had at the time I went up to Oxford. So it was not determined by me, but I accepted my father's advice that it seemed an appropriate subject for me. And with the benefit of hindsight, I'm absolutely clear that it was the only area of work I could possibly have flourished in.
I'm trying to imagine what it must have been like for a shy, relatively immature, lower middle class Scouse lad in Oxford.
Well, I went up to Oxford scared stiff of what I had to face, not least socially, but also intellectually, concerned whether I had the aptitude to succeed. And I had decided I would just work hard, get my head down, and then the term would end and I'd come back to a more relaxed life in Liverpool. It wasn't like that at all, but that was the belief at the time I went to Oxford. And I remember each city we passed on the way down in the car terrified me more and more until finally I was dropped at the Porter's Lodge of the college and went in entirely by myself.
So you didn't, I presume, sound then like you sound now. So
Yeah,
what happened?
I had a pronounced Liverpool accent, and most people spoke, as it were, the Queen's English in the Queen's manner, and had an existing social circle. A lot of them came from public school, but there was no discrimination against me amongst the students or the academic staff of the college. It was a very nurturing college.
It's interesting. I don't know whether it would be like that today.
No, I've had a continuing link with the college, but it tends to be dinners with people of my own generation, and I have little idea how the college operates now. But the only thing that worried me was the Liverpool accent. And I took a conscious decision that it was not an advantage to me to retain it. So eventually it disappeared, initially substantially, but under pressure it reasserted itself, and then eventually in full. At the time I had lost my Liverpool accent, the Beatles emerged on the scene and were a huge attraction to people of my generation. And I think a Liverpool accent would have stood me in very good stead, but unfortunately it had gone by then.
It's funny, the stories you tell yourself. For most of my life, the story I told myself about your accent was that you'd probably correctly come to the conclusion that you wouldn't be taken seriously as a barrister advocating in court sounding like you did, so you had to do something about it. But it sounds that's not quite how it happened.
No, I mean, it was true. If you had a Liverpool accent when I joined the bar, that was potentially a disadvantage and maybe an indication of a lack of stature or something like that. But it was before that I decided I better speak in a way which was going to be more acceptable in the career and lifestyle I wanted.
So
and I have to say I'm rather ashamed of it at the present moment. But
you are ashamed of it.
Yes.
Why?
Well, because Liverpool was a city which gave me huge opportunities. It financed my degree at Oxford and then research degree at Cambridge. It's a city I admire greatly for its personality and vivacity, and I don't very much think well of myself for discarding an overt sign of being a Liverpudlian.
But maybe you wouldn't have had the success you did have if you'd continued to sound
it's
like
sad
that.
to say. I think that is right.
Yeah, it's the irony of it. I didn't know that you there was some shame there around. Does it feel like a betrayal of the city of your upbringing?
Well, I'm, as I say, very proud of being a Liverpudlian, very proud of my city, and yet I took a step to separate myself in part from the city.
Mm.
Those two things don't fit very well together. So in later life, I've not thought as well of myself for the matter of my speech that I did during my career in the law.
Mm. Were there any other parts of yourself that you kind of took a conscious decision to change at Oxford or Cambridge or later?
Well, I remained extremely shy before I went up to university, and it became very apparent from an early stage at Lincoln College, Oxford, that discussion, social life, and intellectual life together with your fellow students depended on a degree of social skills and warmth and that sort of thing. And I was helped to start on this process by some fellow lawyers taking the view that I was too isolated and they wanted to hold a party really for me to get to know people. And that was an unexpected success. And it was the start of being able to form lots of friendships within the college and outside in other colleges of the university, which was a major factor for me. But I still remain shy, but I know I got the skills and experience of disguising it and engaging in normal social relations.
Yeah, I want to kind of put a pin on that and come back to it. But I was thinking about, so your head said effectively, you wouldn't make it in life. Your dad was a kind of a huge advocate for it, for your career, and maybe some of it was vicarious, probably. But some of it natural kind of parental love and desire for success in his child. But so I'm wondering about the motivating forces in that early part of your life. Were you driven because people were expecting, your dad especially, expecting things of you? Were you driven by, a sentiment of, well, I'll show him about the head, or I have something to prove?
I never was sufficiently proactive to think in that way. I think my father, for some reason, formed the view that I ought to have the opportunity to apply to Oxford and Cambridge. I'd already been accepted by 3 provincial universities to study law there, but I was still young and there was time to have another year in the sixth form to do the Oxbridge entrance exams. I had no concept that that was an appropriate step to take. And then my father, out of the blue, announced that I should stay on another year and do the Oxford entrance. Now, that had to get past the headmaster, who had warmed slightly to me, but not to the extent of believing that I could actually qualify for a place at Oxford or Cambridge. And again, my father put his foot down, and I did stay on. And that year was a pivotal year when, particularly in German studies, I had a teacher who taught literature by reference to the history, philosophy, economics of the time, rather than as was traditionally the practice, just in a technical analysis of how the author achieved this, that, or the other. And I was really exhilarated by this. So I suddenly progressed dramatically in the quality of my work at school. But when the time came, the head was still against me, but my German teacher, Spanish teacher, and a maths teacher united together to try and force through my opportunity to sit. And
Your maths teacher?
yes, so the maths...
So you've always told me that you were absolutely hopeless at maths. And...
Well, that is understating it. And it's been a terrible problem in my career, which has brought me into maths. It's in contact with maths in many different dimensions, much to my horror and difficulty.
But the maths teacher must have still seen something in you that had them...
He was Jewish, but I didn't know him particularly well. And I don't understand why he took the view. It may be as a result of speaking to teachers in the school, but he was very proactive in persuading the head to allow me to sit. And I think I told you, I went down, and in those days you had to do incredibly difficult exams, which I think were really of final standard. And they didn't want to see your knowledge. They wanted to see your capacity to think constructively when dealing with a difficulty presented to you. And I think that because of the teaching I had was a feature that developed strongly in me, and I think it's what got me through. But I'd thought, because the exams were so difficult, that I had no chance, and I was just about to leave in the porter's lodge when I heard two other people saying, "Who's this man Harris who's got a second interview?" I didn't know I'd had a second interview, and if you have a second interview, it means you've got a good chance. So I had about 10 minutes to compose myself and present myself for the second interview.
One of life's many sliding doors moments, maybe.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you ever take yourself back to that moment and think, what might be?
Quite often. I mean, I would have gone on to perhaps go to Manchester University, a fine university, or Leeds, and study law, and that would have enabled me to become a solicitor in Liverpool. So it wouldn't have been a total disaster, but it wouldn't have led to the exploration of intellectual potential that happened during my 3 years at Oxford and 3 years of Cambridge. And that set me on a totally different course of going to the bar.
I think it was Alan Fenton that told me, you went to Oxford and came back posh, something like that. But the greater point is, and it was something I was thinking about this morning. So you were telling me just before that home life was quite insular and narrow intellectually, and then you go away to Oxford, your horizons are broadened, you come back sounding different. Did that create any tension or friction? Did you feel the dissonance between who you were becoming and who your parents still were?
I think it did to an extent, and it's an extent that I don't particularly feel proud of. But I had moved on from the background at home. I had a range of different interests, some of them quite intellectual and not subjects which could really be discussed at home. I'd been very close to my sister, who was 8 years younger than me, but she was a companion to me during my years of isolation at home.
Yeah.
And we had a very good relationship. But that actually produced a separation as well. But I was embarrassed about the background I had when everybody else came from an affluent middle-class backgrounds, and I would be invited to stay with people, so I experienced that. I realize now that my parents made huge sacrifices for me, and that my career would not have evolved in the way it did had it not been for them. And I didn't reflect that with sufficient gratitude and recognition during their lifetime.
It sounds like another another area of guilt or a bit of
Well,
shame.
it is.
Yeah.
My father was immensely proud of what I'd done. He loved to hear stories about the cases I'd done and the lifestyle in chambers and at the bar generally in Liverpool. And as my practice developed and work became much more demanding, I didn't feel I had the time to keep my father informed of how my career was progressing. And that is something I really do regret.
Yeah, I can feel that. Back at Oxford or Cambridge or kind of early on in your career, was there a point in time where you felt I now belong in this company or in this community?
To a great extent, it was an evolving process. I mean, the people at Oxford, in my college and in law generally, were very, very supportive and friendly. So there was not a sense of being isolated or out of place in this sort of legal environment. In fact, it was
not externally, but the internal experience, I imagine, was different.
No, because I did pretty well in my first exams at Oxford, and I had a group of friends in the law who got together on a very regular basis and discussed legal issues that had arisen in the tutorials. And I was well able to hold my own in those discussions. So I felt I had the capacity to do this, but the social elements of the career were something of a challenge.
How did you overcome them?
Well, you learn in time that sometimes what you anticipated was unfair and didn't exactly happen.
Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, I think I recognize, because I have a continuing insecurity in my mind, I overstate social problems I'm going to experience. And so when I go into a room, say go back to college and go into a room of people I haven't seen for some time, I feel tense about it. But I know from experience I've got the skills to engage in conversation and to keep it going. So although I always fear I'm going to be a failure, it doesn't normally happen.
And that's worth, I think, emphasizing, not necessarily between us, but for anybody watching or listening, you were a judge, you previously became a QC, what's now a KC, very, very successful career, yet you're as human as the rest of us with
Yes.
ongoing insecurities, which,
Well, when you do a big case, particularly one that attracts public attention as a barrister, however well you've done in the past, it's no guarantee that you're going to succeed in this case.
It's like the football analogy. You're only as good as your last match.
Well, true. And you have to recognize that although you have these feelings you can't ever stop, logically you know that you've got through the difficulties in every case in the past, and the likelihood is you're going to do it on this occasion as well. But the background did give me what I think is not altogether a usual dimension, because I really felt there, but for the grace of God, go I. So when I was dealing, say, in family law, with people who'd had dreadful upbringings and which manifested themselves in poor parenting, they loved their child, and I felt for them, and I wanted to try to see if the court process could be used to reinforce the efforts of social workers to get them to address their problems. I treated people with respect, and I felt if I had to decide a case against parents, for instance, they were entitled to know that their position had been recognized and taken into account, that they were valued as human beings and respected. And the decision I had to take was made in sorrow that they were going to be so badly hurt by, for instance, losing a child or losing a major part of a child's life. And in crime, I told you that there was a period in my life when I was about 13 when I stole some cigarettes. My father discovered this, marched me round to the shop, made me to apologize in public, etc. But had that not been his intervention, I may have progressed along that path into a life of more serious and sustained crime. And so again, when I have defendants in front of me, it's a case of there, but for the grace of God go I. And so I tended to be very keen to treat them with respect, whatever they were alleged to have done, and to make sure that they had a fair trial. So those features, I think, derived from my background and quite important characteristics in my professional career.
Yeah. So there, but the grace of God go I. So that the people that you were that were in front of you as a judge, or that you were defending or prosecuting, or whatever it might be, your mindset was that could have been me. And therefore you're able to have the empathy, the respect for them in that moment, maybe where others in your profession didn't have that capacity.
I would have thought that I could have developed into a lifestyle which made a career in crime a possibility, which could have made me a particularly bad parent. But for the way my family life and life at school sort of intertwined to make me successful ultimately at school and carry that into university, is something I always thought. It was a very strong element that I was lucky that I was able to do that, because had circumstances been slightly different, I would have been deprived of it.
It's extraordinary. And another one of the very many reasons why I wanted to have this conversation, to find out things about you that I'd never understood. In what way, I'm just thinking about those interventions by your dad. In what way were you influenced by him in the way that you parented me and my siblings?
I don't think they were particularly influential in the way I parented our children. I think the greatest influence was Emma, my wife, who was the essence of loving kindness in all dimensions, but particularly in her parenting. What I do regret is that in furthering the legal career, by definition, I was spending every evening working, at least one day of the weekend working. And I didn't, therefore, have the sort of equal status as a parent that you do. You're fundamentally involved in your children's lives, much more than I ever was. I was involved in the broad direction, but not so much in the day-to-day guidance. And that's something another area of regret. I'm not sure it could ever have been different, but I do recognize I should have been more of a hands-on father. That could have meant that your mother was not so much of a hands-on mother, which would have been a distinct disadvantage to all of you. But it's a factor in my thinking. You can't go through life without recognizing that decisions you made, which may ultimately have been beneficial, had harmful and unwelcome consequences.
Yeah, I've thought about this long and hard from different perspectives. So I definitely remember wishing you were around more when I was growing up. But I wouldn't, sitting where we are now, I wouldn't change anything for the world. I mean, you're so first and foremost, we have an incredible relationship, an incredible friendship, which I think has grown stronger over the years. And wasn't, yes, it would have been great having you around more, but that somehow hasn't impeded the bond that we've built together. So that's
I entirely agree with that. But I think the bonds have developed substantially over the last years, partly because I retired and we spent much more time with our family. And in your case, for instance, because we spend a week or so a month in London, we always meet up for lunch once a week, and that's been very important in developing the friendship. So I'm now, and have been for a number of years, doing what I should have done when I was a parent. So that sense of friendship, which is profound with you and actually with your siblings as well, would have happened earlier had I lived the sort of hands-on life as a parent that you and Jeremy and Tim, Anna's husband, have done.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can never be certain, can we? I do also wonder. So you had an incredibly successful career, and I know in some senses maybe it could have been more successful financially. For example, if you'd moved the family to London, that's by the by. But I do wonder for myself as well. Everything comes at a cost, or there's a trade-off, whatever decision you make. And had you been more hands-on as a parent, you might not have achieved the success you did professionally. So that was the bargain that you made, I think.
Well, maybe it's true, and it was inevitably the case. I mean, in those days, particularly the men at the bar did work, well, most of them at any rate, immensely hard. And they were supported in that by a wife who either didn't work or worked part-time or gave priority to the husband's work demands. Because at the bar, you had to work very hard if you were going to be successful.
So let's talk about success a little bit more. What when you were younger, maybe going to Oxford, Cambridge, early on in your career, or even before that, let's say, what would success have been to a 21-year-old David Harris?
Well, as you said earlier, success is subjective and also relative. I regret very much that I wasn't more organized in my work at university. I think it was anticipated I could get a first at Oxford, but I left myself very badly equipped when in revision for some of the examinations, so I didn't do as well as I could have done. That's a regret, but getting a 2-1 at Oxford was still an
No mean
achievement
feat.
from my background
Yeah.
to be to feel proud of. And there have been other things like that. I think the most dramatic success was taking silk, particularly from my background.
And just stopping there for those that, again, may not know, that means becoming, in those days, a QC.
Yes,
what would be now a
yes.
KC?
You had to apply to be a QC. Very detailed soundings were made about you, and you had to demonstrate the capacity to step up quite a distance, to do the work, and to be a leader in the legal community, as QCs were expected to be. So it wasn't merely that you had a successful practice. You have to have the stature in the minds of those recommending you, who would recommend you sufficiently strongly to persuade the Lord Chancellor's Department to recommend you for silk. It was an appointment by the Queen, of course.
How much of, and we'll continue talking about success, but I'm curious, how much of, so you just told me you had to work incredibly hard, like many of your contemporaries did. How much of that was through fear of, I don't know, not being able to make it or not being good enough, whatever it might be, and how much of it was ambition? How much were you trying to get somewhere?
I think it was a mixed picture, and both of those elements operated. You know that when you go into a big case, first of all, you're before the Court of Appeal, or what is now the Supreme Court. Brilliant minds who are there actually to test out the cogency of your submissions. So you're going to get quite a grilling, often politely, not always so, but often politely, but testing. And you are dependent on your speed of thought, your quality of recollection, your ability to change suddenly when there's a change in the case and adapt to that. And you're always a bit anxious that you're not going to be up to that when the time comes. So you work hard to master all the details of the brief, so you're in the best position to adapt. But the other thing is, it's just a natural thing at the bar. You know that every case you do involves elements you could have done better. You may have won, you may have got praised by the court, the client may have been delighted, but you know in your heart of hearts you could have done this bit or that bit better. And you want to learn from those experiences. So there was an ambition to be better in your career, which went alongside the fear of not being good enough.
Can you think of any experiences? We've talked a lot about kind of, and it surprised me about you've regretted this or that, but can you think of any experiences now where you think, really, I didn't perform yes, I could be better, but in this instance, I didn't perform to the level I should have performed at?
I can't think of that particularly. It was commonplace to think that I could have done this better, and to try to learn from that, as I've said. But generally, when the dust had settled, I tend to be satisfied with what I'd done. You go into a big case, as I say, pent up with the fear of failure, thinking to yourself, why on earth am I putting myself through this? But you come out at the end of it having done as well as you could reasonably be expected to do, and feeling, thank goodness I'm in this profession. That was very, very common.
How did the fear manifest itself? I'm imagining the morning of, an appearance in front of the House of Lords. How were you feeling in those moments?
Well, I think possibly the mildest term would be terrified. Particularly in the early days I did this, there were some law lords who had a reputation for something approaching brutality. And you knew that there was a real possibility that this was going to happen. And so it was a very, very tense experience until you'd actually got on your feet, and then things settled down.
Were you, I'm just trying to kind of articulate what the fear would have been. You talked about the fear of failure. I'm trying to put myself in your shoes. If it would have been me, I would have been worried about my knees, my legs being jelly and wobbling, or not being able to get the words out, or going completely blank. Was that the kind of experience that you might have had?
I didn't have that, but you were always worried that these brilliant lawyers who had probably a wider exposure to different areas of law by going through the judicial hierarchy would have areas of knowledge that they would put to you. And it happened to one of my colleagues, Richard Henriquez, who was a brilliant criminal lawyer and fabulous criminal judge. And I can't remember the full details of it, but he got up to make his submission. And one of the judges tried to use analogy in a criminal law problem with looking at some dimension of land law. And he had the guts to say, well, my lords, I'm only a worker at the coalface here, not an academic at a university. So they laughed and let him get on with it.
Yeah, that could have easily gone wrong.
I remember another occasion when I was doing a case in the House of Lords conjoined with another case which had some common features. And the junior counsel in one of the other, that other case was a very distinguished lawyer now. I better leave his name unspoken. I won't. It was David Panic. And
David, if you're listening.
Yes. So the practice was when the QC had finished, the court would invite the junior to continue. And he had the guts to say to them, may I decline your opportunity to speak, my lords, having listened to the way you've questioned my learned leader, I won't want to take up that opportunity. So again, they laughed.
Yeah.
Only somebody like David Panic could have done that.
Okay. These days, the role you were playing as a barrister, there's a performative element to it, and I suppose these days that I have no idea, there may be all sorts of training from, to help barristers from a psychological perspective to be in the best frame of mind in order to perform, to be clear-minded. I'm imagining that kind of stuff wasn't available, so you were reliant on your own wiles to be able to do that.
Yes, I mean, now, for a long time, there is a lot of advocacy training which young barristers have to go through before they're let loose on the public.
Yeah.
There was nothing of that sort during my career at all. But you have the advantage of being in a set of chambers which will contain a number of successful people senior to you, and actually some pretty brilliant people of your seniority or below. And it was always the practice in the chambers I belonged to, but probably generally, that people discuss their cases with senior people. Senior people would give time to give their experience and support, really, and take an interest in what had happened. So you had a source of support in that, which was really, really important. And in fact, it went beyond your own chambers, because it was not uncommon that I might speak to a major silk in another set of chambers who would give time to help.
Was there a competitive aspect to it at all?
Oh, very. I mean, you're in a set of chambers. You are in teams in those chambers. Every member of those teams is an individual practitioner who is in direct competition to you for the same work.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. On the one hand,
Yes.
there's a support network. On the other hand, it's not quite, but it's a little bit dog eat dog.
Well, I think that was particularly so in the early days, because you were dependent on work that your clerk brought in, or some solicitor would ring the clerk without any particular barrister in mind, saying, somebody you can nominate to deal with this case. And you were dependent on your clerk being fair-minded in this. And there was a lot of jockeying for position in members of the chambers. Later on, as I became established, people would ring up and ask for me personally, so that didn't become a problem.
I'm wondering about the psychological challenge of being in a place where you've got brilliant minds. I'm thinking of my own experience at the moment. I'm kind of coming up in the world of executive coaching and frequently talking to or listening to other coaches who are much more experienced than me, feeling on the one hand, this is an education, I'm learning so much, and the sense of inadequacy that goes with that. How did you deal with it?
Well, I always felt, as I said, insecure at the start of a case. I think with the benefit of experience, I knew firstly that this would disappear within quite a short time and I'd be okay. Secondly, I had a reputation initially in Liverpool and then the Northern Circuit, but very much later on, particularly in something like family law. So my submissions will almost always be listened to with respect, because there was a perception that I was going to make sensible points, etc. So I knew this was going to happen, and it enabled me to get over the horrors of the first 5 minutes when my voice was so occluded. I was probably incomprehensible, and eventually I'd be able to make sense. I've exaggerated that. It was the first minute.
And so the advice seems to be, well, certainly when thinking, imagine you're advising me about this feeling of comparing myself to people who are more experienced or incredibly bright, whatever it else. The feeling kind of diminishes the more experienced you become.
Well, it depends on your personality, basically. But if genetic inheritance works on you as well, you'll continue to feel it. But you do know from experience you've done a good job in the majority of situations, and that stands you in good stead. And you know also that probably people have recommended you, just as I know that, say, the Court of Appeal tended to respect me as an advocate. And so that actually goes to relieve the inevitable early nerves.
I have to say, I was talking to two American coaches last night, both of whom much more experienced than me, and it was very comforting to hear some of the same insecurities that I've just been voicing from them. So, again, we are all human. We all have to overcome our insecurities, our doubts.
And certainly at the bar, you will make mistakes. Quite often, if that becomes apparent and you own up, nobody minds that you made mistakes because they know they've made mistakes in their career. It's when you don't own up that is a problem. But you're going to make mistakes and learn to live with them and try and make sure that any mistake you made doesn't have any harmful consequences.
It's no different to mistakes made in our personal lives. I think it's...
Well, yes, but it's more difficult because of the emotion in personal life to make the necessary apology.
Yes, yeah, it's something I'm trying to teach the children.
Yes.
Children, if you're watching. Yeah, I mean, taking ownership for and responsibility for your actions is the key. Coming back to the career, what I don't want to necessarily say high points, but if you think about the moments that have made you most proud, what would they be?
I think that's a very, very difficult question because there are...
That's why I asked it.
Yes. Well, this is why I'm struggling to answer it. Because there are different types of success. There's success in succeeding in a legal argument. There's success in winning a case for a parent who's going to be devastated by it. I think one of the things that always moves me in recollection was a case I did for a lady who had suffered serious cerebral palsy as a result of lack of oxygen during the birth process. She was only capable of moving one big toe, but she was such a character that her objective in life was to try and help others who had similar levels of disability. So she did courses in social work, for instance. And when her case, when she first conceived that she had a hope of gaining compensation, which would have changed the quality of her life, was when she saw a program on television of a situation which had mirrored hers, and she understood there was a potential cause of action. She then had difficulty in getting supportive advice, medical advice, but eventually she got some. And ultimately, she won about £3 million in damages a long time ago, so it was a huge sum in those days. And she said to me at the end of it, I know you've heard this, thank you, you've done so incredibly well for me. And I said, what I've done is nothing by comparison with what you've done. And she said, well, when you come to see me in my Liverpool, which is part of the benefit of the damages, I will show you the video of my skydive for charity.
Amazing.
Well, I did go around and I saw this, and she was terrified out of her mind, white as a sheet when she landed, but she'd done it and raised money. And she is probably one of the most inspirational people that I've met. And
I'm not sure you've told me that story before.
Well, but the success of that case is something that's really important. But probably the ultimate case is one of the conjoined twins, where I was representing the twin who was weaker and was destined to die. And the issue was whether nature should take its course and she would die at, let's say, in 8 months' time, or there should be permission by the court to separate the twins, with the result that she would die immediately on that surgery.
And I'm assuming if she died, what would happen to the other twin?
Well, there was some lack of clarity about that. But the preponderance of the expert evidence was that she had a number of operations she would have to face, but ultimately she would live a life of normal expectation with a very effective ability to succeed in whatever she wanted to succeed in. And
how old were the twins at this point?
Well, they were probably a few months old at the time this happened. I mean, anyway, it truly did happen according to the expectation in the evidence. The separation procedure was phenomenally traumatic for the medical staff, because it was the first time ever that there was to be surgery which affected the child who was going to die, causing her death without any benefit to her in that process. And
just for clarity, so you're representing that twin.
child. But the doctors obviously were faced with an ethical and emotional problem, which they'd never had before, because nothing like this had ever happened before.
And there was a religious element as well, right?
Well, the parents were devout Catholics. They came from Gozo, and the Archbishop of Malta, who was, in charge of of Gozo, from the religious point of view, advised strongly against allowing intervention, giving consent to intervention, saying that nature should take its course, whatever happened. That advice was repeated by the Archbishop of Westminster. So they had that as a religious and moral imperative for them. And they objected, therefore, to the separation procedure.
And at this point, what was your line of argument?
I was instructed by the official solicitor to act for the dependent twin, and it was to argue the case that it was in her interest that she should live to the maximum possible time, even though it didn't have much of a quality of life.
Yeah.
And
were you torn morally or ethically?
I wasn't torn in that way. I was instructed to represent her interests, and my professional obligation was to do so to the best of my ability. I recognized that it was unlikely ultimately that courts would take that course and allow a viable life to be cut short. And so we went into the argument in the knowledge that almost certainly the court would be against us. And that made it somewhat difficult. But it was an extraordinary case, because no court in England had had a set of legal and ethical dilemmas of that sort. And they insisted, and we were all too willing to agree, that there should be a different approach, that anybody who found something of help would immediately disclose it to the judges and to everybody else. We'd all, as it were, support each other to make sure from our perspectives we did the case as properly as we could, but knowing that the court needed particular help. And I've never come across anything quite like it for the cohesion of the legal profession together, and the profession with the judges. It was a a lesson of how the law really should operate in all circumstances, but doesn't.
You're making me think, because I've been thinking a lot myself about the question of one's purpose, and maybe that's a question that you begin to think about when you're my kind of age. Can you articulate what your purpose in life has been?
Well, I wanted to be a decent and good human being.
And that's enough in itself.
Well, yes, but then I had to translate that into how I conducted myself as a barrister and a judge. And one of the things that gives me most pride is that I think I was recognized as being a fair judge, both in family, but particularly in crime, where that's not always the case. So you will remember from the valedictory ceremony that the recorder of Liverpool gave the usual tribute, ignoring every deficiency but praising every quality. But it ended up by saying, but particularly he had a commitment to the administration of justice, to being a fair judge. And I think that is something that gives me a lot of pride, which I do think about from time to time.
It's when I tell people my own story, it sounds all very highfalutin, but the journey that's kind of got me to where I am today and the change in my career, I always go back to you and to say that it was very clear to me, maybe subconsciously in the early days, but as I've given it some thought, how much fulfillment and purpose you had in your career. And that was a real, that's what I've been searching for for such a long time, and which has led me to the work I do as a coach. As you think about purpose now that you've been a long time removed from practicing as a lawyer, how do you think about it now?
Do you mean how do I think now of my experience?
No. Maybe it's a question about kind of legacy. I don't know, but you're no longer, and haven't been for some time, a practicing judge. So your purpose then was around kind of the way you conducted yourself as a lawyer, as a judge. What about now?
Well, it's not a question I've ever asked myself. As you know, since retirement, Emma and I, your mum and I, have a particularly fulfilling life. I worked very hard, which curtailed the opportunities. Although we had, we would go to the Philharmonic Hall.
Amazing lifestyle.
Yes, but now I feel I spent most of my legal career serving the public. I was always very conscious of that. It was, of course, a remunerative and personally satisfying career. But you're there, whether you're a barrister or as a judge, to save, to do your best in the public interest. It mattered a lot to me in Liverpool because I had been financed in my undergraduate degree and in my graduate degree by the city of Liverpool. And it was a great pleasure for me to put back something of the benefit I'd received from the city into the way I conducted justice in the city. But we have a fulfilling life, and I feel I've done my social duty and what I wanted socially. And this last period of my life can be devoted to having a very nice time together and with the broader family and friends.
Yeah, and long may it last.
Yes.
As we kind of wrap up the conversation, if Rosie or Noah, or maybe one day their children are listening or watching listening to or watching this conversation, what do you hope they take away from it?
Well, the first thing is that it's never too late to succeed. I mean, I did very badly at school up till halfway through my time in the sixth form. And nobody in that period of poor performance could have envisaged I'd have had the career I did. But I was a late developer, and there were opportunities to actually take advantage of that development and move into a different sphere of achievement. And I think very strongly about that. I thought very strongly about that in many of the family cases I did, where parents who'd behaved badly actually learnt the lesson in the course of the hearing and were able to change. So it was never too late for them to change. So I would like my grandchildren to appreciate that if things go wrong for them at some time in their school experiences or beyond that, even beyond that, they each have the ability to do well, and they could get over the disappointment of the school career and still be a success professionally in life.
That is a beautiful way to end the conversation. Am I allowed to say no more questions, Your Honour?
Well, like any prolix barrister, the court thinks, thank God for that.
Thanks, Dad.
Okay.